Hi everyone, my name is Kylie and I'm a member of the Adam SA exec team. I'm also a senior English and Media Studies teacher at Pulteney Grammar School. I thought I'd put this presentation together for you today because teaching news packages for TV, how to create them, has been something that I've really enjoyed teaching, and the students, surprisingly really enjoy learning. You would think that it's being a non-fiction text that they would deem it to be a bit boring, but they actually really enjoy the whole process. So I thought I'd share that unit with you, and hopefully it's something you might like to incorporate into your own teaching. Thank you for listening. So as I mentioned before, my areas of teaching include media and English literary studies in particular. And I find that this particular unit marries well with both those areas of study. At the moment, I'm teaching TV news as part of the as a product for the product task in media studies, and that's worth 20%. And there are two products they can do. And often the students will choose to do a TV news package and then opt for something that's more creative. So it really marries well with that subject and that task. It's also something that you can get your students to do in either Essential English or English Lit Studies as one of the creative texts. And so it's a point of difference. It's just something that they can do that's different beyond a narrative. So yeah, it's quite flexible in terms of where you teach this particular unit. Here I have just a quick overview of what I'm going to be covering in the presentation today. So there's a theoretical component where you're talking about what the purpose of the news is, and you're looking at the content of news and who the intended audience is. Obviously that's very essential when it comes to SACE works. And then we have how to find the news story. Students often struggle with, what is newsworthy? What do I talk about? I don't know what to talk about or what to write about in my story. So these are the sorts of techniques you can actually engage with them to help them discover a story that they might want to write about and present. How to write the script, the news writing conventions, the equipment that you need when you go out in the field and you go to, film your interviewees and do your piece to camera and gather all your B-roll vision. What the B-roll is, how to find it, how to film it, interviewing your talent. There's a few tricks of the trade there. What the piece to camera is and how to deliver it confidently. Finding your news voice. Again, there's some tricks to achieving that really authentic, authoritative tone to your voice. Recording the voiceover and editing the news package. So that pretty much outlines the process that the students need to undergo to be successful in this task. I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of the theory regarding what the news is. I'm just going to give some key terms here and concepts that you can research yourself, and there's also some resources that I'll have available, make available on the Adam SA website for members and members resources section that you're welcome to have a look at and use if you like. But in general, what I teach my students, and I do go into detail about this because I have the Year 12 guys and gals, but what it is essentially, it's the gathering, assessing, creating and presenting news and information, and it's a really essential role in a democratic society. So the healthier the society, the healthier the news, and vice versa. So journalism is classified as what's known as the fourth estate. So we're basically, as journalists, you're keeping an eye, you're the watchdog, and you're keeping an eye on all the other aspects of the estate that govern our societies. And in Australian terms, it's basically keeping the bastards honest. So it's a really important role and really significant in a democratic society. So these are the concepts that you can talk around when you first introduce this unit. So as I said before, you determine how much detail you want to go into in terms of the theoretical underpinnings of this course. But if you want to keep it really simple for your students, and it depends on what year level you're teaching it at as well, obviously, this is the tripartite formula, really, in terms of explaining what the purpose is of the news. The most important one is informative. It's to be informative. It's to inform the public so that the public can make decisions that, informed decisions that impact their lives and the lives of others. It's obviously educational as well to some extent. and to some extent it's entertaining. And there is the argument that it's becoming more entertaining, and there's more of a demand for that in our society, but that's a whole another debate for another day. But pretty much in order, that's what the news is all about, the purpose of the news. Another concept you can talk about with your students is that the concept that truth is a shifting paradigm. So the journalist's job is to be as objective and neutral as possible. We don't have an opinion. Our job is to gather the voice of the many others that make the story. Every story is told through a different perspective, and so journalists are very aware of that. And I remember learning about this when in first year journalism at UniSA way back when, and it was actually a very difficult concept to get your head around when you first introduced to it, that there is no truth. I mean, that's a philosophical debate that you can argue with in your classrooms, in those class discussions, but yeah, the idea that truth is a shifting paradigm is a really interesting concept. So the key there is to be aware, allow students to be aware that bias creeps into all writing, and our job is to try and eliminate that in so much as is possible. So as I mentioned before, the biggest question that your students will ask is, I don't know, what do I cover? Tell me what to do. What story is interesting? Where do I get an idea for a story from? So there are a couple of tricks to the trade. The first thing I would say is actually watch the news. And the other thing is to look at the 5 Ps and the news values. And these news values underpin pretty much every story and determine whether or not it's newsworthy. So just going back to the 5 Ps, I remember learning this from a gentleman by the name of Tony Cook, who was working for the BBC for many, many years. And he was one of the lecturers at UniSA at the time. And he explained that, people are interested in the princes, people, prices, places, and politics. Everyone wants to know about the elite, how the other half live, and the mystery that imbues them, and and everyone likes to see them fall as well. That whole concept of schadenfreude, you build them up and you knock them down, and it makes us feel better about ourselves and our own achievements in our own world. You only have to look at the Meghan Markles of the world to see what I'm talking about there, and that extends the news cycle. It keeps the news stories fresh and whatnot. So people, by that I mean people who are just like us, the common folk, not to offend anyone, but I certainly would put myself in that category. We're really curious to know about others like us because it allows us to place ourselves in the world. Where do we position ourselves in society? It just helps us gain that better sense of self-awareness and identity. And then, of course, everyone wants to know what things are going to cost them, hence prices, places. We can't travel everywhere, certainly not at the moment. So we love learning about different places and different people in, far-flung parts of the world that we can't necessarily access. And finally, politics. Maybe our students would find this one a little bit more difficult. Not all, but a bit less palatable at this point in time in their lives. But so party policies, certainly in the lead up to the election that we've got coming up, this is going to be an important one. So this is just a quick snapshot of the news values, and these are really important. This is what every journalist learns when they're first starting out, and you'll see all those ones there. The most important is conflict, because at the heart of every story that we love, there is conflict. It's the driver of every narrative. And it's no different for news. If it's conflictual, the story, then it's going to make the news. So that's pretty much the one that's going to feature in almost every hard news story. So I'm going to whiz through these really quickly. I won't go into too much detail, but really, if it's impactful, what it means is that there's a lot of people who are going to be impacted by the story. So it's a numbers game. And if you look at things like, you may remember back in 2018, the Indonesian flood, that was in the news everywhere because it was impactful, because more people were affected than, for example, the local flood in Queensland at the time. There were multiple deaths, and it's also a really popular holiday destination for Australians, back in the days when we could travel. If you look at the other example, the 2022 federal election that's coming up in May, obviously the news is going to be all over that rather than India's election, because it's not really impacting too many people here in Australia. So that's pretty much summarises that one. So news has to be new by its very nature, obviously. So the timeliness factor, more recent events are going to take precedence or have prominence rather in the news than ones that happened further back in time. So yes, we've had new restrictions that were eased, and we can all dance at weddings now as of a couple of nights ago, and so that's really important to people. People want to read about that more so than the restrictions, ease of restrictions that happened a week ago. So this one's a pretty obvious one in that sense. So I'll just pop myself over here. Prominence. If you're a Swiftie, in particular, you're going to be really interested in someone as prominent as Taylor Swift, and she's dashing through the streets of Notting Hill with a coffee in hand. That's far more important than myself, Ms. Ryan, making a mad dash in between class time to a cafe for a coffee. No one's going to want to read about that. So the more prominent you are as an individual, the more attention you're going to obviously receive in the news media. This one is one I have an ethical issue with. Proximity means that it's twofold. It can be geographical or it can be emotional, and more often than not, they're interrelated. So if you have a story, for example, the British man, culturally he's closer to us, so there's that emotional connection. It also happened in Sydney. I'm referring now to the shark attack last week. So it was all over the news. You couldn't escape it. But no one knows about the French troops being withdrawn from Mali after 9 years, by Macron. So what does it mean to us? We'd have to probably go away and research what was happening in Mali for the last 9 years and beyond. So that's what proximity essentially means. And that's what makes a story newsworthy, if it's close to us, either geographically or to our hearts. This one's always a good one, and the Northern Territory News up north really relies on this particular news value and plays to it quite regularly. You'll notice their headlines there on the front page, all silly puns and often not always appropriate or borderline. So weirdness, if it's weird, it's going to make the news because it's not common everyday occurrence. So the old one, adage, a dog bites man, isn't half as appealing as a man bites a dog. That's out there. So we're going to want to read about it. Currency is another good one. It's quite related to timeliness, actually, and sometimes it can confuse the students. It just simply means that topics that are in the spotlight and usually go on for quite some time because they're of current interest to a large number of people. I remember the moment when Princess Diana died. I remember exactly where I was standing at the top of a sort of curling staircase in London. And, it really shook me, and I had to hold back the tears, even though I wasn't a huge Di fan. Still remember that moment. The whole world does. 1997. And then you've got all these other stories that made them news in subsequent years. And of course, from 2020, we've just been smashed with COVID stories. Although the Russia-Ukraine conflict might actually supersede that. We'll see how we go. But so that's what currency means. As I mentioned before, with conflict, that's the major news value. And let your students know as well that most stories, the more news values that they hit, the more newsworthy it's going to be. So, it might be conflictual, obviously it's going to be timely, and it might be a current story. It might also be bizarre. So it's not just one, there can be multiple per story. So this one, if it bleeds, it leads, that old adage. And I've also included here different types of conflict which feature in a story, and students have probably been exposed to this before in English when you're talking about narratives. So, there's the person versus technology, society, other people, nature, and internal conflict, person versus self. So now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of the unit, looking at the practical side of it. There are two types of stories in the news. There's the hard news story, and that constitutes the majority of the news bulletin. I was going to say the nightly news, but in actual fact, it's 24/7 news cycle nowadays, as you know. So hard news stories are the majority of news stories that feature in the bulletin, and then you've got soft news stories. Often there'll be one place at the end of the bulletin, the cat's rescued from a tree by a fire truck, things like that. And it's also the sports news stories. That's why they're put at the end of the news bulletin, because they soften, the blow, so to speak. We get bombarded with so much conflict and negativity. So that's it's a good way to end the news bulletin. Anyway, looking at the structure, you're not tied to that. Students may deviate from this a little bit, but generally it's very formulaic, the way these are put together, and they can vary, but if you show the students this, it'll take away the stress, and if they follow this, they've got a great news story. Right, so just looking at the writing plan, what I've done here is I've mapped out what to do when. Often students get themselves all tangled up, they don't know what to start with, they don't know where to begin. And so really the first thing they need to do is research a story, and they need to find a news angle. They might pick up stories in the news and look at a local angle, something that's relevant to them or young people, or they might find a new fresh angle for a story. And that's important to note as well. You have a story that might be current and it runs for a long time, but to keep it fresh and to keep people informed, you're going to be finding a new focus, new angle all the time. And often if you listen to the radio in the morning, there'll be a particular story and the angle of the news changes with every hourly bulletin. So they find a story and they find a focus, and that allows them to really concentrate on one thing and not get bamboozled with too much information. And then you ask them to research that particular topic. Then what they can do is they can write their introduction, and then what they need to do, and by all means research this, it's all over the web, the news pyramid. They need to write in the news pyramid structure style. So you write your introduction, which is a summary of what's happened and the outcome. So if it's a house fire, for example, 3 people have been injured and 1 dead in a house fire, or, in whatever suburb. So you have the outcome in the introduction, which is the inverse to what you do in a narrative. And then what you get the students to do is you get to write the facts in descending order of importance. Because in the news, people are time poor, so they just want to quickly turn on the TV and they just want to get the quick snippets of information that's important. And then if they've got time and interest, they'll then delve into the facts and the deeper facts. Tell the students, this is the trickiest part you'll find they'll struggle with at first, is try and think about what you want your interviewees to say and what you want to say to your piece to camera, which is when the journalist is talking direct to the camera, because they can leave those gaps in their narrative, or they can approach it another way. They can write the whole news story. They can go away and preempt the section of that story of their script that they want their interviewee to say, or they want to say in their PTC, and they can just regurgitate that later, which is another little trick to the trade. Then when they're writing their conclusion, instruct them that a conclusion in the news media usually has a future projection. So it just allows people to stay informed and to preempt what's going to happen next. The court case will happen at the end of the month, or, the police are still investigating the issue, or whatever it might be. Or the, ESA restrictions update will be happening next Thursday, whatever. And then let the students know that their story duration must be 1 minute 20 seconds. If it's 10 seconds out, big deal. It's a school project. They're not restricted by the bulletin itself and airtime, but you want them to try and make it as authentic as possible. And in terms of how to time that, generally the formula there is journalists speak around about 3 words per second, so they can actually time themselves to make sure they've got it right. There's a whole plethora of information about how journalists should write, but what I've done here is I've condensed that information to make it easier for your students and for you to teach it. And these are the most important things. If the students can get this right, if they listen to the news and emanate the structure and the language, and they follow these rules, it's going to sound like a pretty authentic news piece. So the first thing to tell them is that it needs to be very conversational and informal register. So everything they learned in English, throw it out the window. You're not writing academically. It's very conversational. So they just need to write it as they would speak it. Keep words simple, don't use fancy words, and don't use adjectives and adverbs because they carry connotations, positive, negative. Their job is to maintain neutrality. So again, very difficult to do when you first start. You have to get rid of all the, extraneous language that make it sound pretty. So it's meant to be factual only. Use the present tense. It's new, so make it sound, give it that sense of immediacy by using that present tense, or future tense where appropriate. Past tense, just reserve it for when you're backgrounding things. Logic dictates here, but that's the rule of the game in this context. Use transitions, meanwhile, however, also, to, but, and. It signifies that you're segueing to a new sub-theme within the story, heading in a different direction. Allow the vision to speak. And again, that ties back with don't be too verbose, try and minimise your words. It's the vision that carries the story in a TV news bulletin. So that's really important. Write your grabs verbatim. They can't make things up. They need to be true to their interviewee. They need to make sure they don't misquote them. That's really important. And also, this is the trick, and students often struggle with this one, is that they can't repeat in their voiceover what has been said in the grab. You have to try and write around the grab, introduce it in general terms as a lead-in, and then allow the grab to speak. And by the grab I mean the sound bite that comes from what the interviewee said. What I have here is an example of a TV news template. It was taken from a National 9 News story. I won't go into detail because you can read this in your own time, but I'm just going to map out really quickly how it's structured and some of the terms. What is in red, just let your students know, that's just instructions to them about what things mean or how to write certain things. So they can delete that in their template for their own stories. The story slug simply means a story title, and that's the title that everyone uses in the newsroom, so no one gets confused with who's doing what. The duration that we have here, this is written as an authentic, because it is, news template, but that duration that you see there doesn't include the newsreader introduction, which you'll see as the first section of the table. What I would get my students to do is I would get them to actually include that newsreader, what's normally read by the newsreader, the introduction, in their news package. So them as a journalist would actually say that as a voiceover with B-roll vision to go, because otherwise if they try and set up a news studio scenario and they try and pretend that they're the news reader and then throw to the package, it looks a little bit amateur. So it's better if they just create a news package. Some students do it really well, but usually they're the students that have access to the material and equipment and the studio or some sort of setup that's going to make it look authentic, and not everyone has access to that. So that's just a little tip there. So if you'll see in the left-hand column, that's the visual. That's what people see in the news story, and on the audio is on the right. The visual features supers. That's the intertitle text that will appear on the bottom of the screen. It will say, Kylie Ryan, ABC News, or whatever. Or it will also say the name. It'll be the name of the interviewee and their title. You'll see that there's different types of shots. Students are probably going to be really familiar with shots, again, through other studies, film studies, media. So the different shot types and camera movements. But I've provided a list of all those on a subsequent slide, so you can have a look at those in your own time. So the shots will go there. So I mentioned the supers. There's on the right hand side you've got the reporter voiceover, VO. That's just written in normal font. Then when you'll see, if I just put my cursor there, hopefully you can see that, up top, that just means it's an instruction to the tape editor back at the studio when they're editing it to upload the sound for the talent. And the first talent here is WA Police, is it Daryl Lockhart? Yeah, so in all caps, that's him speaking, and we can see him on screen. As you can see, there's a two-shot of him talking to the reporter. You have your time signatures here, so that's where it starts on the tape. The tape, even though it's digital nowadays, we still use the old terminology, and the duration is 9 seconds. So you can see the details for the grab. That helps the editor when they're putting it all together back in the studio. I'll just see if there's anything else I need to explain there. You've got the capitalisation of the piece to camera. All right, here we go. Piece to camera is up here. That is when as you're probably aware, but your students won't necessarily be, the reporter is breaking the fourth wall. They're talking directly to you like this, and they've got the microphone and they're actually saying usually a couple of sentences that fills in and it's on in situ as well on site, and it's just giving more information about the story. And what it does is it adds credibility to the journalist's story and it makes it seem more real. And I think file viz, that's just the file vision, more vision of cars and the police blitz. And then we have the sign off here. Marianne Ellis, National 9 News. Tell the students that when they're doing their PTC, they might have it in the middle of the story, they might have it at the end, but always do the sign off. Because when it comes to editing it, they might decide, if they might have it in their minds that they're doing it in the middle of the story, but then later on they make a post-production decision to actually have it at the end, it looks clunky if you edit it together. It really needs to be in that one take. So you can always cut it away later, but you can't add it. So always add it when you're filming it on site, so you've got that option. So I'm obviously not going to go into too much detail here, but I just wanted to let you know that there's a list of glossary of terms here that pertain specifically to the types of shots, camera movement, camera angles, and terminology that needs to be included in the TV news template. So this is the terminology that you'd be using as a news reporter. On this slide, I've just mapped out the sort of equipment that you're going to need or students will need when it comes to doing this unit. So obviously when they're researching and writing their script, they're going to need internet access, and we call that desktop journalism. Most journalism nowadays is done via research online or syndicated sort of news sources. So obviously it's a big cost saver, and the students will be doing exactly that. They'll need their laptop. In terms of filming, they don't have to have fancy equipment. They can just use their smartphone. It's really the editing and sound as well as the editing where you really make it look like an authentic piece. But a smartphone, iPhone, you name it, whatever, is going to be absolutely fine. Ideally, it would be great to have a gimbal or a tripod. You can make them, the homemade ones, from aluminium foil. And at the end of this presentation, I've got a couple of or a few links there that show you how to, one of which shows you how to do this. But you don't have to have all the fancy equipment. Ideally, have an external mic for the piece to camera. Some of these student exemplars I've made available to you, you'll see that their piece to cameras aren't necessarily brilliant because there's extraneous sound. That really helps to get rid of that kind of thing. But again, it's not a deal breaker if they don't have access to that. Recording the voiceover. So they need a laptop, external mic, and voice recording software. And in terms of editing, they can use whatever their preferred software is. iMovie is the obvious easy one. The students will choose that themselves, and you will find, if you're not an expert in this, do not panic. I certainly am not. The students are really quick to learn and they generally teach themselves. So that's one aspect where they have a lot of independence and control. If you're comfortable with those software, those applications, brilliant, but don't worry, the students will be all over it and they'll have that mastered, no problems. Here I'm just showing the difference between what the A role is and the B role. For those of you who aren't really familiar with this terminology, the A roll is the filming that you do on the day when you're out on location, and it tells the story. So it drives the narrative in news packages and documentaries. And more often than not, it involves the people talking on screen. So you've got your interviewees with your talent and your piece to camera that you do as the journalist, where you're breaking the fourth wall and talking direct to your audience. The B-roll shots are really, really important, and sometimes students will get themselves caught out and they won't have enough B-roll footage. When they go out on the day, they go out on site, they need to make sure they really think about shots that are going to be really interesting and relate to their story. So they augment the A-roll images. So, things like long wide shots or establishing shots, close-ups of signs of maybe the business or the organisation they're talking about. They might have panning shots left to right where they're, people walking through the mall, close-up of, they might have close-ups of, or anything that's, if it's to do with a particular product or anything, close-ups of that item. So they've really got to get more than they think they're going to need, so they can play with it later when they're editing. Otherwise they'll get caught out, and they'll be repeating a lot of the shots, which, you know, does weaken the quality of their story. This isn't an exhaustive list, but this is just a quick crash course in the sorts of shots and camera movement that you would be using when you're shooting your TV news package. Most of these you'll probably be familiar with from other disciplines, but yeah, so again, it's pretty formulaic, and it doesn't require extensive knowledge of, you know, camera work per se. When it comes to interviewing the talent, a couple of roadblocks students might encounter. The first one is there might be a bit of timidity in approaching people, contacting them. You know, they might prefer to email or text, and they don't get a response back for days. This is the sort of thing that can really hold up the works. So it's encouraging them to make that phone call, to explain who they are, to explain that, you know, really there's a limited audience. It's just, say, their teacher, or maybe, you know, it'll be a film night, so it'll be the school community. But just to encourage them to be courageous, to say who they are and take that step forward and contact the expertise that will help augment their story. That's the first thing to flag. The other thing is to reiterate they need to be polite, to thank the talent because they're taking their time to help out. The other thing to flag also is it doesn't need to be a really long interview. It only needs to be about 10 minutes of footage at the most. 3 to 5 questions, have them pre-prepared. Think about what you've written in your script and think about what information you want to plug into that script. What can they say that they can't find in their secondary research online that's going to really add to the information that they're presenting to the public? Be aware of background vision and extraneous noise. So I mentioned that before. Great if they got mics, lapel mics, boom, whatever it might be. It doesn't matter if they don't. And the background vision, it needs to be relevant. It needs to carry the story. They might, again, as I mentioned before, they might be standing out in front of the hospital if it's something to do with the hospital, or the research centre, or, you know, they're talking about the arts suffering because of COVID-19. It might be out in the front of the entertainment centre. So it has to have context. Don't put, obviously, the talent in the front of the sun when they're squinting while you're filming, and help them with the logistics of putting on the lapel mic if it's available, things like that. And make sure you're all organised before you start. Always make sure you tell your talent that you're recording. It's a legal requirement. And students need to be aware of as well. Don't interrupt. You know, they think they're being polite by going, yeah, right, all those sorts of things. You can't edit them out easily later. So they have to really discipline themselves to be quiet when the response is being given, so that they've got a clean cut or a clean, grab for later. Tell them also, don't edit those grabs. It looks terrible, and you probably see on some of the exemplars I provide, it does take away the quality when you can see that they're edited in between and also it gives a sense that you're leaving something out that should have really been exposed to the public. So let the students know they need to get a really clean grab. And I think that's pretty much it for that one. This is a really important concept for the students to get their heads around, and you'll see again in the exemplars I've provided that not all of my students have quite got it right. Some feel compelled to have their talent actually looking down the barrel of the camera and breaking that fourth wall. They shouldn't be doing that. The talent should be standing with the reporter standing in front of them who's asking the questions, and the camera needs to be just offside. So you'll see in that image there that the gentleman is actually positioned camera left, and the reporter's standing right in front of him where that arrow is, and the camera person is standing to the left of the reporter. So you're in a bit of a triangle per se. Generally speaking, the interviews are done as a medium close-up or medium shot, and that's pretty much all the students need to know. And really it's either eye level or slightly low angles, so it kind of empowers to a degree the talent. So the information that's available on this slide is really just explaining what the purpose of the piece to camera is, that there are 3 types, as I mentioned earlier. There's the opening, which I would avoid doing with your students. It can be a bit tacky. The bridging piece to camera happens in the middle of the story. And then you've got the closing, which is the easiest one for them to do, I think, where they give a couple of sentences of information and they conclude. It'll include the conclusion and the future projection, and then they'll have their sign off, Kylie Ryan, ABC News. So that's the easiest one. Then, as I said before, it's filmed on location. It gives that sense of immediacy. It's all happening now. It's designed to create a rapport between the journalist and the audience, hence the breaking the fourth wall. And yeah, it's designed to give authority and credibility to the story and to the reporter. In those images there, you'll see that there is one in particular, the lady here, I'll just point the cursor there. That's an unusual one, and that was probably a soft news story. So the students don't have to do that. There is one that you'll see there about, the dog food quality. I think one of my students did, where he is doing it's not really a soft news story, but he does break the typical piece to camera rule, and he's sort of squatting on the ground like she is and looking up at the camera, patting a dog. So they can break that rule and vary it a bit, but the easiest is just to stand and deliver with the medium shot point blank at the reporter. So this is just more information about how to conduct the piece to camera. A lot of this I've already mentioned already, but a couple of things that are added here are that suggest to the students that they wear business attire and if they've got long hair, to have it tied back so they're not sort of brushing it all the time out of their face and out of the way. It just actually looks a bit unattractive. Unprofessional rather, and also to hold their head really still and to hold their hands really still. There's a bit of a nervous tendency to twitch, and sort of that one hand might go up and down, and just to really practice holding still. It feels unnatural, but it actually looks so much better on camera. The other thing to also highlight is if they're doing a piece to camera on their phone, to turn their phone sideways. A little trick. It's awful when they get back to the classroom and they feel frustrated because they've gone out, down to Port Adelaide or Port Noarlunga or somewhere far flung from wherever, your school is, and they have to go back out there again, find time another day because they didn't film it right. So if they're pre-prepared, it's going to be much easier for them. So this one's always fun. They've done their filming. They're back at the ranch and they've got all their footage, the A-roll, the B-roll. They've done their piece to camera, and they've written a script. Now what they're going to do is they're going to actually record their voiceover, and they're almost home and hosed. It's nearly done, in the bag. And now they have to try and work out how to speak like a news person, like a reporter. So these are the things that you can highlight for them. This is what they need to actually finesse. They need to finesse their diction, their intonation, their pace, emotion. They need to sound authoritative. They need clear pronunciation. And the first thing to tell them is, seriously, watch a news story and find your favourite news reporter and see if you can copy them. So diction, as you would be aware, it's basically how you pronounce the words. So it's actually correct pronunciation. It's finishing your words, your consonants at the end of your sentences, end of your words, before you move on. So you're not liaising all your words, French style. The intonation and inflection. In Australia, we tend to talk like this and we go up and down, and it sounds like we're asking questions all the time. And that really kills the authority when you're delivering a news story, because you don't want to sound like you're asking questions. You want to sound like you're knowledgeable and you have the information and you're imparting that to your audience. So the inflection, you really need to end every sentence with a downward inflection. So that's another key point. Pace needs to be relaxed as you would speak. There's a tendency for all of us, or most of us, is to speed up and when we're nervous, and so that's really important. Emotion is an interesting one, and they find that it hard to wrap their heads around this one. You're not meant to be this emotionless creature when you're delivering the news. It is authoritative. You can't get overly emotional, but you can have little inflections of emotion, especially when it comes to stories that are really devastating, catastrophic, or there's an element of sadness. So you don't want to sound completely cold. So you can get that in your voice, and there is a fine art to that. Authoritative. Interestingly enough, ladies, the lower your voice, the more it sounds like a man, arguably, the more authoritative it sounds. So there is a way of finding your news voice, and I'll mention that in the next slide. So the lower, the better, and obviously pronunciation. This is a doozy. For the students, it's not an issue unless they're being lazy and don't prepare and they're trying to screech it over the finish line at the last minute. You need to practice reading your script out loud. In a real newsroom, you only have about an hour to turn this around. Deliver on air, go back, refresh your stories, find new stories, edit your stories, practice them, and then go back on air again. So know how to pronounce difficult or foreign names in particular, that they can catch you out, but also scientific or technical terms, they can be a bit tricky as well. So just flag that with your students. Right, so this is the slide where I get to embarrass myself in front of strangers. So you can have a laugh next time we actually do get to meet in person. So the students have a lot of fun with this one. It's a bit intimidating at first, but it's where they get to make lots of strange noises in an attempt to actually, first of all, warm up their voices, but also to find their news voice. And there's a real trick to that, which is really cool. So, and this does make a difference to the quality of their voiceover, by the way. So it's actually worth having a lesson with them on this, and it's fun. So obviously there's a neck roll, so, you know, getting them to relax themselves, and there's the hidden yawn, which opens up their voice. So it's kind of like, ooh, doing a little yawn, a few of those just to warm up the back of the throat. And then we can rub the cheeks to get the smile. So if you get them to sort of raise their cheeks like this and then just rub them, it allows that inner smile to sort of come through when they're talking, so that their voice doesn't sound flat on delivery. There's also, singers will know this amongst you and amongst your students as well. There's the humming in the morning. So it's getting your lips buzzing with sounds. And I'm not going to do it here because I don't think I can actually do this one, but it's getting that sort of vibrating lips thing going. So it really helps them to relax their face, but also to get that sound move forward. The two that I refer to, the ones that are really valuable, are the witch's cackles to warm up. And that really does help because it gets the diaphragm moving. So they're actually speaking from their lower, diaphragm rather than through their throat, which is tiring and also very thin sounding. So they'll do things like, if you get them and you do it with them so that they don't feel self-conscious, when I make that sound, the witch's cackle, you're moving your whole face, but you're also really warming up that diaphragm and engaging that. So it's really dropping my voice so that the power's coming from there and not here. The other thing, and this is the key, the fire engine allows you to find your news voice. So I'll just demonstrate that for you. If I was to go, Radio Adelaide, National and Local News, good morning, I'm Kylie Ryan. And then if I do this warm-up, which goes something like this, hopefully I'll get it right the first time. Radio Adelaide, National and Local News, good morning, I'm Kylie Ryan. Can you hear the difference? That last note that I can hit when I'm doing the fire engine, that is the note that I want to talk at when I'm actually speaking with my news voice, because that's the tone that will give it more authority and more depth. So there you go. I've just done a witch's cackle and a fire engine in front of a whole bunch of strangers. So lucky I can't see you right now. Before they record, get them to place their voice forward and get their inner smile. So if I were to talk like this, Radio Adelaide, National and Local News, good morning, I'm Kylie Ryan. If I get that smile happening in my cheeks, Radio Adelaide, National and Local News, good morning, I'm Kylie Ryan. There's a little bit more animation in my voice, which you can probably hear. And also, if they can, get them to record standing up with the lion stance. So that's that real proud, open the shoulders, open the chest, head up, to really open up the airways. And again, it makes all the difference. Finally, relax and breathe. Key when they're doing their voiceover is not to stop and start, not to edit sections, because it does sound a bit disjointed. So see if they can do it all in one take. So they'll need to give themselves a bit of time to achieve that. So this section is actually really good fun. Well, folks, we're heading towards the end of the presentation, and this is really the last section I need to talk to you about before I show you a couple of student news packages to give you an idea of, what students have produced in the past, and you're welcome to use these with your students as well. The kids that feature in this have given permission for that, so that's all good. Editing tips. As I said before, your students will be all over the packages. Sorry, you can probably hear my dog scratching in the background. So all you need to do here really is to ensure that they have access to these applications and to advise that to make sure that first of all they've done their research. Have they looked at student exemplars to get a feel? Have they watched the news at night time to get a sense of the structure and what they need to do themselves? Otherwise they're flying blind. They need to also ensure consistency of sound quality and the volume. And that can sometimes vary between, your talent, your PTC and your voiceover. So they really need to make sure that they modulate that and get that even. They also need to be consistent with the colour grading. Probably don't have to do too much there, but that's just something to be aware of. They need to be make sure they've got accuracy in the delivery of their voiceover. So if they've made errors, start again. If they've given themselves enough time, they'll be able to do something that's pretty clean. If they've rehearsed, that is. Smooth transition of shots and also length of talent interviews and also your PTC. The exemplars I'm about to show you, they're not perfect, and based on all the information I've given you today, you probably see where they've maybe fallen short a little bit, but they are still have held the grade A or A+. So they're pretty good, even if they're not perfect. Right, smooth transition of shots. Okay, so make sure it's edited well. Vision isn't repeated. Again, having enough shots on your footage on your B-roll to make sure you're not having to resort to that. And making sure they've got supers where required. So the reporter's name, the news organisation, and your names of interviewees. And then also, one thing I haven't mentioned is that graphics can be edited in during the post-production. You might have a close-up of a report that they're referring to. There might be maps, those sorts of things that they can actually add later as well. They need to keep in mind that the majority of their report, I think the rule is 30% with SACE, has to be no more than 30% of the footage can be taken from other sources. And they also need to attribute that. If they get it from YouTube, they got it from Channel 9, you'll see some of my students have just put that in the bottom left or right hand as a super down below. You have to acknowledge footage that you've received or gleaned from elsewhere. But the majority really, for it to be top quality, has to come from their own, their own camera work, their own footage. Well, folks, that's pretty much it in terms of the instruction and advice that I can impart to you all about how to put a TV news package together or how to assist your students in doing that. If you have any questions, I'm really happy to take them. Please do send me an email to that email address below, which you can see there on the screen. And also there'll be additional resources as well as this presentation available to you at the back end of our website if you're a member. So please do join up if you're not. Okay, thank you for listening. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of some students' work. Sorry if the sound quality isn't all that good in the across this software. Fingers crossed it works okay. It certainly did in my practice run. Yes, but it's not going to be perfect, but I think it'll be enough to give you an idea of how to, what the students can actually produce when you teach this course. So thanks for listening. I hope you have fun with it. Take care, and I'll hopefully see you in person at an event coming soon.
The United States Food and Drug Administration have released a new report that has explored connection between dog food and fatal heart disease, called canine dilated cardiomyopathy. The American and Australian research links these cases of the fatal disease to an increase in peas and lentils and the omission of gluten in pet food, vital to assist in their digestion. The American FDA states the disease is caused by a mix of ingredients found in over 500 food brands and is mostly found in dry food. Reports of the disease jumped from 2 cases in 2017 to 320 in 2018, prompting immediate concern and action from animal health experts. Head veterinarian at Semaphore Vet, Dr. Alison Booth, says owners are unaware of the contents of the food they are purchasing and in some cases are projecting their own dietary requirements on their dogs.
And as you say, projection of their own values. So there's no science.
The Food and Drug Administration have identified dog food brands consumers need to avoid, such as Taste of the Wild, Blue Buffalo and 4Health. Consumers are advised to access the report available on the FDA website to check clarification about the foods they should be purchasing for their dogs.
I always check the label for peas, lentils and whether any grains are present.
The message from veterinary experts is clear. Only purchase pet food manufactured by Australian brands, and always check the label for harmful ingredients before purchasing any food for your animals.
Jake Lasasso, Student Adelaide News.
The pilot shortage has now hit Australia, threatening major disruptions in the industry. Between 2016 and 2017, the number of pilots has decreased by 12% worldwide, from 51,000 to 45,000, and continues to decline yearly. Boeing statistics predict 640,000 new pilots will be needed over the next 20 years to sustain the industry globally. According to Emirates International Airlines captain David Denham, the problem lies in the attracting and obtaining of pilots in the industry.
Without so many pilots, that meant there's so many aeroplanes coming, people are working to the maximum hours and are getting very tired, and mistakes are being made.
The decline of pilots in Australia is causing an increase in delays and cancellations of flights. According to Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics, the pilot shortage has caused nearly 11,000 domestic flight cancellations last year. The University of South Australia's aviation professor Gary Boxell says now is the time for more young people to join the industry.
It's a good time to get into aviation now because there's a large pilot shortage worldwide. Southeast Asia alone will need over 500,000 pilots in the next 2 decades.
Professor Gary Boxell says female school leavers are strongly encouraged to consider aviation as a career. The aviation industry is working to improve wages and working hours, which in turn should attract more young people to the pilot profession and further the industry's growth.
The Australian government is calling for more young school leavers to enter the industry in order to prevent these shortages from worsening.
It's still a wonderful job. I mean, it's got the best view from the office of any job I've ever had.
Isabel Denham, Student Adelaide News.